All right, getting into the outlier inspection. So we're going to start looking at the outliers by generation, kind of giving us a little bit of context to where the outliers are appearing. And we're going to look at each of the statistics and just get a good sense for really where these outliers are occurring and where the most extreme outliers are occurring. So here we can see we're using a box plot. So seaborn.boxplot data equals df. Y is our total, so we're plotting the total on the left-hand side, and we're going to separate it by the generation. So when we put a category feature into one of the accesses on Seaborn, it will automatically know that we want to separate those by that feature. So here we can see the generation. We really have one outlier, one significant outlier that's higher. These whiskers are 1.5 times the interquartile range, which is the size of this box. So 1.5 times that is considered the standard valuation of an outlier. We can see that in generation 1, we have one outlier, really one significant outlier, and that's the only time it's really occurring. If we look at HP by generation, we see in generation 1 and 2, we have quite a few outliers in all of the generations, but 1 and 2 have the highest outliers. I'm trying to remember if that would be Snorlax starting with the red and blue Pokemon way back in the day. So here we'd find we're going to do another box plot looking at the attack by the generation. So we see the attack. There are outliers. It's not as extreme as the outliers in HP, but we still do have some outliers here. We don't really have outliers in the 5th generation in terms of attack. So for whatever reason, they don't have significantly stronger Pokemon in that sense. So here, what we have is y is equal to defense, and we're sorting by the generation. And so we can see here that in almost every generation, except for the 4th, we have some outliers with strong defense. In terms of special attack, we're going to look at the generations in terms of special attack or by generation. And so what we're doing here is generation 1, 2, 3, and 6 have significant outliers, although not extreme like we saw in the first in the HP column. They're existent, but they're not so extreme. We want to note these and be aware of this. It depends on what we're going to do, but we might not need to change these in any real sense. So looking at another box plot of special defense by generation. So we can see here that it is occurring in general by generation. So speed and plot, and then our box and plot is looking at the speed by generation. And really, generation 3 seems to have or contain our outliers for speed category. So whatever happened in generation 3, maybe they were having some super good, I don't know, they were all eating their vegetables, and that could be why. Who knows? But we do know that in generation 3, we have our outliers for the speed statistic. So we're going to look at the box and plot now, or box plot again, for type 1 in terms of type 1. So we're going to do the same thing we did, just looking at it in terms of type 1. So we can see that type 1 water has our outlier. That's where our outlier, a positive outlier, is hold, and flying has a low outlier in terms of type 1 in terms of the total points. Looking at type 1 in terms of total HP, and we see that normal has the highest outliers. I believe this Pokemon would be Snorlax. That was my favorite Pokemon as a kid, and that would be the outlier Pokemon. The SNS.boxplot for the attack, and then sorting again by type 1. So we're going to look at attack by type 1, and we can see that they're kind of outliers in all of the categories, but noting that steel and normal have outliers on the bottom side. So we have outliers almost on 2 sides of the distribution, depending in what context we're looking at it. So looking at defense now by type 1, and we see that we have outliers kind of across the board. We don't have any outliers on the left side of the distribution, on the bottom side of the distribution, only on the top side. And then bug has the highest outlier for a normal or for defense in terms of type 1. So special attack in terms of type 1, and we can see here that again we have outliers across the board, and that psychic has a generally there's no outliers, but we see have a very spread out distribution for the psychic in terms of special attack. In type 1, looking at special defense, kind of all across the board outliers, Notably, we have an outlier on the bottom side of our distribution for flying. We have a very low special defense, and we have a very high special defense for the bug type. So very interesting. So looking at the speed in terms of type 1, and we kind of have outliers across the board, but we do see that we again have flying, and there seems to be a flying Pokemon that has really kind of is on the outlier in terms of the bad side. It's not the outlier in the good sense, it's an outlier in the bad sense. So if we look at the using logical indexing, so we're going to say if the speed is greater than 75, and if the DF type is flying is equal to flying, we're going to look at that data frame, and this data frame is just one type, and we can see here the Noibat is the flying type 2 dragon, and this is where we have our outlier in terms of the flying when the speed is very low. Okay, so looking at the same plot, the same idea by type 2, we see total. Again, we have kind of all across the board, we have outliers, but not extreme in the sense of the total scores. But here we can see that Steel has, in terms of total scores, some very, very low total scores. So something to be conscious of when we're looking at the Steel Pokemon. There are some that are just really kind of a cut or really outliers on the negative side. A really interesting point about the type 2 in terms of HP, we can see here we have a ghost Pokemon that has almost non-existent HP. Hopefully this has really good defense. So there are some outliers on kind of both sides, but notably that the ghost Pokemon has a really low HP stat. And so type 2, the attack, and we're looking here when we see type 2, we don't have as many outliers, a little bit more consistent across the board, but we do have some outliers on the upper side of every statistic or every category in the type 2. In terms of type 2 in defense, we see that we have a little bit more consistent outliers on the upside, but notably we have an outlier on the lower side of the psychic Pokemon type 2. The secondary type is psychic. We have a very low outlier over here, so something to be conscious of when you're building your Pokemon team. And we see the special attack in terms of type 2. Not as many outliers here, kind of more generally, it's kind of inconsistent across the board, but with less outliers. So every type seems to have a generally or vastly different distribution for their special attack. And looking at the distributions of special defense in terms of type 2, we again see this, that they are quite different in terms of where the distributions are sitting depending on the type. But here, notably, we have a rock with a very, very high, a very strong outlier, and only real one that's pulling in the direction of that. When we look at box plot in terms of speed, in terms of type 2, and we see that a little bit more consistent across the board, but poison and flying tend to hold our outliers on the positive side, and rock and electric hold our outliers on the negative lower side of our distribution. So the last one we'll look at is by generation. So if we look at the total by generation, want to see where we're seeing. So we have generation 1, we have one outlier, so let's inspect that. And we do logical indexing, so putting this in parentheses, we put one logical argument, then and the other logical argument. So we have total is greater than 750, and that the generation is equal to 1. So when we look at this, we see that Mewtwo is our kind of outlier Pokemon in this sense. So we have name X, name Y. I remember this being a special way to get the special Mewtwo, but I've never actually achieved that. But we can see here that this is where the outlier stat is coming from. So when we look at the data frame, when we look at the HP by generation, we see there's outliers kind of across the board, but in generation 3, this is where the outlier, the low outlier happens. The outlier on the lower side of our distribution happens in generation 3. In terms of attack and generation, we see kind of more generally across the board. We don't see as much variation in generation as we did with type, either of the types. And so, but we do have some outliers kind of across the board. We always have kind of years with really good attacks, but there only seems to be 1 or 2 Pokemons in every year that has a really high outlier attack. In terms of defense, we see the same sort of pattern, very consistent across the board in terms of generation. but we see that there are some outliers in every generation. In generation 4, not so consistently, but we can see this longer whisker here means that there could be some just outside of the, or just inside the outlier range. So if we look at a box plot now by the special attack, again, pretty consistent by generation, but there are a couple outliers per generation. And I suspect that we'll find the same thing in special defense. And again, we see a few outliers, not by every generation. Generation 1, 4, and 5 don't have any significant classically defined outliers. And then the next one is the box plot, and we're going to look at the speed by generation. So we can see only in generation 3 do we have any outliers, and all the rest of the generations are more consistent across the speed statistic.